Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today we're going to be continuing the 2018 year-end list with my top 20 favorite albums of 2018. Now 2018 was a year that brought us a lot of great music, many great songs that I talked about recently in my favorite songs of the year list, and now we're going to be talking about the best albums. And 2018, as I just said, had a ton of great albums in it. So much so that narrowing this down to even 20 picks was a little bit difficult for me to do. However, I am confident in the 20 picks I have here on this list, and I think that these are all albums worth checking out. Now, a couple of other things I need to say before we get into the actual list itself. First and foremost, this list is entirely based on my own personal opinion. It's not necessarily the list of the objective best 20 albums to be released in 2018 or anything quite like that. This is, of course, based on the albums I heard in 2018 and just happens to be the 20 that I found myself enjoying the most, the ones I came back to the most, and the ones that impacted me the most after hearing them. If you have a different opinion than mine, that's perfectly fine, and in fact, feel free to leave your own list in the comment section down below of top 10, top 20, however many albums you want to include. Just put your favorite albums of the year down in the comment section pretty much. Also, I do have a Rate Your Music list that I've made linked in the description down below as well that contains every album I've heard in 2018 ranked in order from favorite to least favorite. And on that list, of course, you could see what albums were really close to making this list, you know, the honorable mentions, if you will, as well as just really all the albums I heard this year. And as I hear new music from 2018 going forward, I will add it to that list. So that list may not stay the same as it is when I upload this video initially. However, this video will always exist here on YouTube to record what my 20 favorite albums were at the time that 2018 ended. So yeah, with all of that said, let's get into the actual list itself. This might be a bit of a long one here today, but I will try to keep my descriptions of all these albums brief. However, if you want to see my further thoughts on them, I have reviewed all of these in some other context before, so you could just look up those reviews for my further thoughts. Alright, coming in at number 20 on the list, I have the Now Now by the Gorillaz. Now this is one that might surprise some people who have been following my channel, considering when I initially reviewed this album back in June, I was positive towards it, but I wasn't crazy about it or anything. And then when I did my Gorillaz albums ranking back in September, well, my opinion hadn't really changed all that much. I still liked the album, but I wasn't super crazy about it. However, this album has stuck with me a bit more than I initially expected. This album came out towards the beginning of the summer, and it had a very summery feel to it. And I thought that as a result, it was an album that was maybe going to stay in rotation for the season, but once fall came around, would probably get less plays from me. However, this album has still stayed in rotation despite fall coming and going, and now winter's here as well, and I'm still enjoying this album a fair bit. And I can understand why people wouldn't be as crazy about this album as some of Gorillaz' other works. It's nowhere near as experimental as some of their other things. It doesn't pull from anywhere near as many genres as well. This is definitely a lot more straightforward than what we've ever really gotten from Gorillaz before, with the exception of the fall. But I feel like this album, despite the fact that it is very simple compared to a lot of Gorillaz' other music, it's still done really well. It pulls off that very calming, summery feel excellently, in my opinion, and it's just an album I can constantly come back to and always have a good time listening to it with how laid back it is in some senses of the word. So yeah, this is definitely a pick that I can understand why other people wouldn't care for it as much, but I enjoyed this album a fair bit. It's definitely one that grew on me. Next up at number 19, I have Book of Ryan by Royce the 5'9". This is an album that saw Royce getting a lot more personal. This album, the theme of the album is him talking to his son, explaining his own life and all the lessons he's learned to an extent. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that's covered here on this project. For example, one of the ones that really stood out to me as being pretty interesting was how he talks about his father being addicted to cocaine and how this would influence him later in life being addicted to alcohol, and how he's now afraid, even though now he's clean and no longer an alcoholic, he's afraid that his son may one day go down the same route because it's just in his genes at this point. It's a pretty interesting story that's told. It's not just confined to one track on the album, it's spread across multiple songs. I feel like that was really well done. And that's just one example of the stories that he decides to tell here on this project. They're not all cautionary tales. Some of them are very positive memories he decides to share, and he also shares some lessons he's learned through those as well. There's other cautionary tales or more negative stories he tells as well on this thing, but regardless, it's all a very interesting experience through and through, getting to hear what he has to say, how his upbringing really affected him as a person, and how it's affected him as a father as well. The rapping on this thing is pretty great too. The concept is well executed. The production here is pretty decent as well. definitely an album you should check out if you're a hip-hop fan and haven't done so already. Next up on the list, I have the debut album from Charlemagne's Menagerie, No Signal. This is the music project of fellow YouTuber Viral Rack, who also does music reviews and things like that. Check out his channel if you're like the stuff I do here, because it's pretty similar. But this is the debut album he released this year, and overall this is a really interesting album with the various sounds that it pulls from. It pulls from various different types of electronic music. You have some chiptune thrown in there as well, which is a pretty interesting texture that you don't often see used, especially with some of these other genres that he's pulling from. You have some industrial influence on here as well, both in the more electronic vein, but also in the rock vein as well. You also have some more alternative hip-hop features on this thing as well. It's just a very interesting mix, and on paper it might not seem like something that could work well, but it's executed nicely enough on this project to be a very interesting listen. The way this album is sequenced, it's done so in a way where there's never really any jarring changes between genres or anything quite like that. The entire listening experience is pretty smooth overall. And another thing that helps tie the album together nicely are the lyrics on this thing, which all have a very consistent feel and tone to them, being kind of dark, depressing, paranoid feeling. It's for a pretty interesting listen overall. So yeah, check this one out if you haven't done so. Next up on the list, I have the newest album from Ninja Sex Party, Cool Patrol. This is just a really fun album overall, and that's why I really love a lot of Ninja Sex Party's music. But this one here, aside from just being a fun album, also sees the band continuing to evolve and experiment with some new sounds. This is the first full-length comedy album from the group to feature Tupperware Remix Party, providing a lot of the backing instrumentation here. And I've always said that I love when these two bands collaborate because they just mesh together so perfectly, and this album demonstrates why. A lot of these songs are given a more rock feel as a result of Tupperware Remix Party's presence, and a lot of these songs feel a lot more developed as songs than on previous Ninja Sex Party albums. I feel like on older albums from the group, while I like the tracks on there, I felt like the comedy was kind of the first priority, and then the songs kind of developed around it. But here on this album, a lot of these songs, remove the comedy element from them completely, and they still stand pretty strongly as fun, catchy, and enjoyable rock songs. So yeah, I just really love the more developed sound that this album has going for it overall. The addition of Tupperware Remix Party really opens the doors to a lot of new possibilities to explore for the group, and they explore a lot of them here on this album. However, they do still have a lot of fun comedy moments on this thing as well. A lot of the lyrics on this thing are still pretty funny, make me laugh, or at least put a smile on my face. So this is just an album I can always come back to when I want to have a good time. It's not a super serious project or anything quite like that in terms of the lyrics. However, the actual emotion and passion put into this thing is definitely very serious. Some of the finest comedy I've heard in a while, at least in musical form. So yeah, listen to this one. Next up on the list, we have Isan with his new album, Amber, that came out earlier in 2018. This is an interesting mix of progressive metal and black metal that Isan has been exploring in some other recent efforts of his, but this one here might be one of my favorites yet. This album has a lot of black metal influenced moments, from the very angry, aggressive, shrieked vocals that pop, darker black metal moments. There's also many moments of more beautiful sounding progressive metal that pop up on this thing as well. And Isan's clean vocals really help sell a lot of these more beautiful, clean sounding moments here present on this project. And I especially love when some songs are able to have both the very nasty, aggressive black metal elements and then just transition more nicely into the cleaner progressive metal elements too. Definitely a pretty interesting metal release, and definitely one that you should hear if you're a fan of the genre. Next up on the list, I have Star Cruiser by Vinyl Theater. Now, I like Vinyl Theater's album from last year, Origami. I thought it was a pretty solid pop rock album overall, and I thought that when I heard that album, while it wasn't one of my favorites of the year or anything, I thought Vinyl Theater could have a really bright future with the direction that they were heading, and I thought that one day these guys could release a really great album. And I really didn't expect it to be so soon, because this new album of theirs that just came out in 2018 is, a pretty great pop rock album at the end of the day. I know pop rock tends to be a genre that not many people look to with a whole lot of interest or respect, and, between lots of newer acts not really being all that interesting, and many older rock bands jumping into that category in recent years and not really doing all too much interesting with it, it's understandable why. But when I hear albums like this, it really reminds me what some good, solid, fun, catchy pop rock can do. And one thing that's pretty interesting about this album to me is that it tries to do a lot of the things that many pop rock bands out there try to do but don't really succeed at, but this album pulls it off really nicely. Many of the hooks on this thing are incredibly catchy and get stuck in my head rather easily. The instrumentation on this thing, while still, a rock album at the end of the day, pulls a lot of influence from more poppy sounds, electronic music. There's even a track on here that pulls some trap influence sounds as well, but manages to pull it off rather nicely, unlike many other bands that try to do it. Vinyl Theater actually pulled it off. So yeah, if you're looking for some good, fun, catchy pop rock, Star Cruiser is probably some of the finest that you can get from 2018, so give this one a listen if that interests you. Next up on the list, I have Post Traumatic by Mike Shinoda. Mike Shinoda is best known as being a part of Linkin Park. He's done, the rap vocals for the group. He's done lots of other instrumentation as well. Really, a really talented guy overall. And this album that he dropped in 2018 is one that is intended to explore a lot of his personal life following the death of his fellow Linkin Park bandmate Chester Bennington. And overall, this makes for a pretty interesting listen, as you get to see Mike open up here on this project about where his life has really been since that happened. Now, I myself am a pretty massive Linkin Park fan. I mean, I did review all of their albums here on the channel, so that should be pretty apparent at this point. But of course, Chester's death was something that affected me quite a bit, given how much of a fan I am of the band's music. And I have to really imagine that it affected Mike even more so, given that Chester was his bandmate and really good friend as well. And despite the fact that I was in no way, shape, or form connected to Chester nearly as much as Mike ever was, this album still is one that I can kind of relate to in some regards, as a way to kind of, understand what someone may be going through following the loss of someone else. There's some more dark cuts on this thing where Mike explores a lot of the negative emotions he's felt following Chester's death, including the tracks Over Again and Hold It Together being some of my favorites in that regard, and just some of my favorites on the record in general. But there's also moments of hope on this record as well. It's not a completely depressing listen or anything quite like that. Mike isn't just interested in exploring a lot of the sadness he felt. He's interested in really diving into a lot of the emotion he felt at the time. There's moments on here where Mike sounds angry, hopeful, at times just more introspective and kind of coming to terms with what's going on, and it makes the lyrics constantly interesting, or varied to say the least, on this project. The performances on this thing are also pretty great. The rapping from Mike is great as it usually is. The singing on some of the more poppy cuts here is also pretty nice on his end. The production here is also pretty great as well. I like how nicely it pairs up with the more personal feel of the lyrics and just the project overall. So this is definitely a project that I'm not sure everyone out there will enjoy quite as much as I did. I have a feeling that Linkin Park fans and people that can relate to a lot of the stuff Mike is talking about here on this record might like it more than someone who has no connection to the group or any experience quite like this. But at the end of the day, I am one of those people who can relate with it. So yeah, I ended up liking it quite a bit. So yeah, good album overall. Next up, we have Some Rap Songs by Earl Sweatshirt. This was a pretty interesting project we got from Earl earlier this year. Unlike a more typical album, Earl decides to go for a pretty short runtime here, but not just in the regard of the album length as a whole, but also the individual songs themselves. Many of the cuts on this thing are really short, like being around a minute short. I don't even think there's a cut on this thing that exceeds 3 minutes in length. But Earl definitely showcases how you don't necessarily need a super long runtime on an album to say a whole bunch of stuff, because despite the fact that this thing is like the length of an EP, he packs a whole album's worth of content into it. This feels like a normal album's worth of content packed into a very dense, shorter runtime. You could spend long amounts of time analyzing what Earl's saying on all these songs, but to keep it really brief, all the lyrics on this thing are pretty dark, pretty introspective, pretty depressing as well. And I really like how the lyrics on here feel very personal, but at the same time really open and relatable. I also really like how the more lo-fi production on this thing pairs up with a lot of these lyrics and their subject matter. It just creates an overall really personal sounding project at the end of the day. And I typically tend to like a lot of those very personal, passion project sounding albums, and this is certainly one of them. So yeah, great lyrics, great rapping, great production. This is a fantastic album at the end of the day. I can see why some people may not be super interested in it, especially given the style it goes for, and the runtime of the songs and all of that, but for me at least, I really dug this one. Next up, we have The Sciences by Sleep. this is a comeback record for these guys, given that they haven't dropped an album in a good long while. But this is definitely an album that showcases that these guys could still make some really fantastic music. This album might not be as, brand new sounding or experimental as some of Sleep's earlier works were. However, this is definitely a fantastic display of this band still being able to release and record and write a great record in 2018. The band still keeps that very spaced out sound on this project. In fact, this might be the most spaced out in some regards, especially given that the vocals on this thing are nowhere near as aggressive overall as they were on previous Sleep projects like Dope Smoker or like Holy Mountain. They feel a lot more calm overall, and it just creates a very soothing, but at the same time heavy and hazy atmosphere that I quite like. The tracks on this album are sprawling, some of them lasting several minutes long, like beyond 10 minutes in length. And many of the riffs on this thing are some of the most memorable I've heard this year. If you're a fan of this type of music, this album might not bring anything super new to the table in terms of the genre as a whole, but it's still one of the best from the genre I've heard this year. A fantastic release from these guys, and it's just great to see that these older bands can still release great albums in 2018, especially given the long amount of time since their last album was released. Next up on the list, we have Tupperware Remix Party with Together Through Time. I mentioned Tupperware Remix Party earlier in this list when we were talking about Ninja Sex Party. Remember, they were the guys who were performing the background instrumentation on that album. But aside from doing that this year, these guys also released an album of their own. And this album comes following several EPs that the group had dropped in the previous years. All of those EPs I found to be pretty good. In fact, some of the later EPs in that series, like Lady World and Guardians of the Zone, were some of my favorites of their respective years when it came to EPs. So I've been dying to hear what these guys could do on a full-length album for quite a while, and this year they decided to finally show us, and really it's everything that I expected, and I'm quite happy as a result. I would describe the sound of these guys as kind of being a mixture of like 80s Van Halen with the funkier side of Red Hot Chili Peppers and Daft Punk as well, but even then that's not a perfect description for it. It's just a really interesting mix of sounds overall, and I just really love the very positive vibe that this album has going for it. It's not positive in a way that feels cheesy or forced. It's positive in a way that feels very genuine, and as a result, you just feel very happy listening to this thing. Many of the hooks on this album are incredibly catchy. Many of the features on this thing also provide a very interesting mix of sounds as well. However, the album doesn't feel really inconsistent as a result of a lot of these features. They bring a lot of different sounds in, but the end result still feels very cohesive, which is something I really enjoy. So if you're looking for a really fun, really enjoyable synth rock, funk rock album, this is definitely the project for you. And I'm really happy that these guys were able to deliver a project that was as enjoyable as I was hoping that it'd be. And I'm really excited to see what these guys decide to do in the future. Overall, yeah, give this one a listen for sure. Next up, we enter the top 10 on my list with my number 10 pick, Veteran by JPEGMAFIA. This is just an incredibly interesting and experimental hip-hop album. I like how JPEGMAFIA is able to take a lot of the attributes of more popular modern hip-hop, trap music, if you will, and put a very experimental and interesting twist on it. And as a result, JPEGMAFIA ends up sounding a lot more interesting than a lot of these other artists nowadays that are trying to pull off that more modern, poppy sound, but just kind of doing so in a way that sounds boring. JPEGMAFIA, on the other hand, is consistently interesting and exciting throughout the run of this project. The production across this thing sounds like this glitchy industrial take on more modern hip-hop. The just overall vibe of a lot of these tracks just comes across as really aggressive and really in your face. And a lot of the lyrics on this thing are equally over the top and aggressive, though at the same time when you boil it down, it's a lot of stuff that ends up being kind of relatable in a sense. It kind of feels like JPEGMAFIA takes that really outrageous side of internet culture and just applies it to the lyrics here on this album, making a lot of them feel just really exaggerated, really over the top, but in a really good way. And I really like how this very over the top feel connects back to the very over the top delivery of a lot of these lines as well. The rapping on this album is fantastic. The production here is equally interesting as well. The singing when it pops up on this thing is also fantastic too. This is just definitely an album you need to have on your radar if you're a hip-hop fan in any sense of the word. And I just have a feeling that JPEGMAFIA is going to continue to do great things in the future when it comes to future releases, so definitely keep an eye on him as well. Next up, we have Dirty Computer by Janelle Monáe. Now, I had never listened to Janelle Monáe's music prior to this year. I'd heard great things about her, but just never got around to quite listening to it. So when she had a new album out, I checked it out, and it was a pretty fantastic release overall. One of the best mixtures of pop, R&B, and hip-hop I've heard in a good while. I love how bold and upfront and poppy a lot of these tracks sound, while at the same time having a deeper, more introspective feel to them. Janelle Monáe singing on this album is fantastic. She really helps sell a lot of the emotion that these lyrics are carrying. Her rapping on this thing is fantastic as well. The production here is great too. It just really pairs up nicely with a lot of these pretty poppy, but at the same time interesting songs. So overall, if you're looking for a really great, catchy, fun pop record, but at the same time want an album that has a lot of depth to it, this is an album for you, because this album is incredibly catchy. At the same time, it's incredibly fun and not particularly difficult to listen to, I'd say. But there's a lot of depth here as well that you could really sink your teeth into. So yeah, give this one a listen for sure. And next up on the list, we'll be transitioning from one of the poppier releases on my list to one of the less accessible overall. We're talking about the newest album from Portal, Isan. This album is just some really dirty, really nasty, very hellish sounding death metal. I just really love how cacophonous and evil this album sounds. All the instruments on this thing just sound like a whirlwind of noise pretty much, especially on your earliest listens. However, when you give them the time and the focus that they need, they're really technical and really interesting. And at the same time, despite the fact that they're quite technical, they're unlike a lot of more modern technical death metal or just technical metal in general that sounds really overproduced or sterile. This still sounds very grimy, which I quite enjoy. The nastiness of this album is only furthered by the vocals on this thing, which are quite unconventional for death metal, kind of being this mixture of your typical death growl and like a whisper. I'd say it might sound kind of weird explaining it, but when you hear it, it makes perfect sense. It just gives this album a whole nother layer of creepiness and just darkness. So yeah, if you're looking for a really interesting, unique, but at the same time cacophonous, noisy death metal album, then this is the album for you. Moving on to the next position on my list, we're going to be talking about God's Favorite Customer by Father John Misty. Father John Misty has always been pretty critical and sarcastic in tone on his previous releases. However, on this album, he keeps that tone for the most part while kind of critiquing himself in a sense. Unlike previous efforts where he seems to be critiquing society as a whole or relationships or things of that sort, he's kind of talking about himself here, which is something that I find to be pretty interesting. It makes this album a bit more personal and at the same time relatable. A lot of the cuts on this thing, like Hang Out at the Gallows and The Songwriter, carry a more somber tone to them overall. However, you do have some tracks on here that have a bit more of an upbeat feel, like Mr. Tillman, for example, which is just this more fun-sounding track. However, it's still just as critical of himself as a lot of the other more somber cuts are on this thing. Outside of the lyrics, a lot of the instrumentation on this album is fantastic as well. It just sounds very beautiful, and it pairs up quite nicely with a lot of the emotions that he's trying to deliver through the lyrics here on this project. Father John Misty's singing on this project is also pretty great, and he also manages to sneak in some of the best hooks I've heard this year on this album, on tracks like Hang Out at the Gallows and Mr. Tillman, for example. All of the tracks on this album just feel really well put together. So if you're looking for a very introspective and personal album this year, definitely consider giving this one a listen. Next up, we have Taboo by Denzel Curry. This album is a pretty interesting hip-hop release from this year. I like the 3-act structure to this thing and how it gets progressively darker as it moves from act to act. I like some of the more upbeat, if you will, tracks early on in the first part of this album. I'm kind of not sure if upbeat is the word I'd use there, considering there are still some pretty dark topics brought up in this first act of the album. However, comparatively, it is the lightest of the three in terms of subject matter. There's a lot of tracks on this album that are just really aggressive, dark, banging songs like Sumo and Perks and Vengeance that features JPEGMAFIA that we were talking about before. A lot of the darker cuts on this album are ones that I really like as well, like The Blackest Balloon or Clout Cobain, for example. And I really do feel that the album, throughout its run, does manage to get darker overall. And I really love the third act of this thing the most for just how dark it can really get at times. Denzel Curry's rapping on this thing is fantastic throughout. The production here is very dark sounding, though at the same time takes a lot of influence from trap and more modern hip-hop sounds, but does so in a way that's still new and exciting and interesting. The features on this thing are pretty great as well. It all just comes together for a fantastic hip-hop experience. And if you're a fan of great hip-hop albums, this is one that you should definitely hear. Next up on the list, we have Beth Haven with their new album, Ordinary Corrupt Human Love. This album is overall just a really fun, enjoyable mixture of black metal and shoegaze music. Like the Isan album I was talking about earlier, I really love how this album is able to balance those more aggressive black metal tendencies with the cleaner, more beautiful sounding music. And I especially love how there's many moments on the album where these two different sounds aren't really confined to their own tracks or anything. More often than not, these two sounds share the same track, and the way that there's so much packed into a lot of these songs makes for a very interesting listen every time you give this album a spin. I also think that this album just flows together very nicely from start to finish. It feels like a very complete experience, and despite the fact that this thing runs a bit on the lengthier side, it never really feels that way when listening to it. So yeah, overall this was a really enjoyable album from start to finish. If you're a metal fan and you're looking for something enjoyable from 2018, this is the album for you. Next up on the list, we have Death Grips with their newest album, Year of the Snitch. This was a pretty interesting project, in my opinion, for Death Grips, because it's kind of the opposite of their last full-length album, Bottomless Pit, in my opinion. That was an album that had a pretty consistent sound to it, but it's still, each track on the album worked on its own. Whereas this album, each track kind of has its own thing going for it in some regards. Many of these tracks experiment with sounds that Death Grips has never done before, but it still comes together for a very cohesive experience. Like, take some of the influences and individual tracks on this thing alone, and you really wouldn't expect a cohesive project to come out of it, but for whatever reason, a cohesive album still does come out of it, and, I'm not really going to complain about that because this is a fantastic release. Whether it be the more rock-influenced Black Paint or the more hip-hop focused Streaky, every song on this album seems to have a personality of its own to it, almost like each track is its own little world that you get to explore as you progress through the album. However, they still all come together really nicely, and I think this in part is due to a lot of these tracks transitioning into each other rather nicely, despite the fact that taken on their own, they may not sound like they would flow together nicely. The transitions that they're able to pull off on this album are some of the best that I've heard all year, and they really help sell this thing as a cohesive product rather than just a collection of random tracks, because I feel like without some of these transitions, that's how Year of the Snitch might feel, but when you add these transitions into it, this thing becomes a really cohesive, really diverse, and really interesting listening experience. This is probably one of my favorite Death Grips albums just overall, which seems to be a little bit of an unpopular opinion, but I would still stand by that just because there's so much you can get out of this album, despite the fact that, in terms of its runtime, it's not all too different from the typical Death Grips album. So yeah, to sum things up, Death Grips released another fantastic record that you should definitely check out. Next up, we have Daughters with their new album, You Won't Get What You Want. This album is one of the most dark and anxiety-filled listens that I've had in a really long time. And I mean that in a good way, of course. This is one of those albums that when you listen to it, it feels almost like an experience. And I do think that some people talking about this album might oversell how scary this thing could be at times. But, maybe that's just me being really used to more aggressive music. Maybe something like this doesn't feel quite as scary to me as it might to someone else who isn't super used to this style of music. But still, this is a really dark, really suffocating release from these guys that just also has a lot of experimentation thrown into it as well. You have your more typical Daughters tracks that are just more straightforward and aggressive, like the Flammable Man and the Lord song, for example. You may even want to throw in the closing track, Guest House, into that category too, with just how aggressive and scary it can be. However, I'm kind of afraid to throw that track into that category because there's a whole lot of other stuff going on in that song as well. And then you'll get your more experimental, just odd cuts on this thing, like the fantastic Satan in the Wait, or Ocean Song that experiment with longer song lengths and just more of an atmosphere to them. I'd even throw in the end part of Guest House into this category because the track transitions from this more aggressive cut into this more atmospheric outro that really ends up ending out this album on a fantastic note. So if you want a really unnerving, anxiety-filled, stressful, noisy, dark listening experience from this year, This album is the perfect album for that category because it really covers all those bases rather nicely. But this album's also made in a way where every track feels like a very unique experience. It doesn't feel like you're getting the same thing over and over again with every cut here, despite the fact that every song has that really dark, stressful, anxiety-filled feeling to it. Every song on here also has a very unique sound to it, and every time you listen to this thing, every track is its own unique thing that you could really sink your teeth into and dissect. Overall, this album is just fantastic at the end of the day. I know this album has received a whole ton of critical acclaim behind it. Lots of people love this thing, and I guess I'm just going to be boring on this one and say that I'm with the majority on this one when I say that this thing is one of the best of the year. Next up on the list, we have Idol by Horrendous, one of my favorite technical death metal albums to come out in recent memory. Kind of like the Portal album I was talking about before, this is a project that takes the more technical side of metal music, but does it in a way that isn't super sterile or overproduced or mechanical sounding like many modern bands in that genre sound. This is an album that is pretty technical overall. It's pretty progressive as well. However, it still sounds very human. The compositions on this album are very interesting and varied. None of the songs here really sound the same, despite the fact that there's still a very consistent feel to this thing from start to finish. The vocals across this album are also consistently interesting. At times they just sound really throaty and deep. Other times they sound more akin to like a bark or something along those lines. You also have some clean vocals pop in here on occasion. The vocals across the thing are just really interesting, to say the least. And the instrumentation on this album, as I said before, manages to sound very technical and complex, but not to the point where it starts to sound mechanical and dull. Something that many other bands seem to have a problem understanding. Horrendous, at the end of the day, remember that making quality songs is the most important part to an album, not really showing off how fast you could play. So yeah, this album overall is a fantastic death metal release. It's definitely not your typical meat and potatoes death metal by any stretch of the imagination, but at the same time, it's not this overly produced, overly mechanical sounding technical death metal album, anything quite like that. It's kind of this nice middle ground where it still sounds very human, very dark, very aggressive, but at the same time has that technical edge and that progressive influence as well. All the performances on this thing are fantastic. All the song compositions are fantastic too. It's just a really exciting listen from start to finish, and one that I could not stop playing throughout the year ever since first hearing this thing. Alright folks, we've made it to the #1 spot on the list, my favorite album of 2018. A pick that probably won't be too surprising to you if you follow my channel to any extent, considering that this is the only album this year I gave a 10 out of 10 to. I'm talking about Iridescent by Brockhampton. Now, Brockhampton topping my year-end list isn't something that should be super surprising. I mean, all three of the albums they released last year were in the top 3 spots of last year's list, so this album ranking pretty highly on this one isn't something that should come as a shock to any people who have been following my channel. Though there was a part of me coming into 2018 excited to hear this new Brockhampton album that was afraid that this thing wouldn't live up to my expectations pretty much. Though I'm really happy to say that it did live up to my expectations. In fact, it exceeded them by being, my favorite release of theirs so far. And since crowning this album with the 10 out of 10 I gave it back in September, this album hasn't cooled on me in the slightest. I still do stand behind that 10 out of 10 score. What I really love about this album is that Brockhampton is able to pull together the most cohesive album that they've released so far, while still experimenting and going off in completely new directions that they haven't explored yet. There's some noisier sounding moments on this thing that don't really sound like anything we've gotten from the group before. You have some members of the group doing new things. For example, Bareface has started rapping with the group now, aside from just singing, and that completely changes some of the dynamic in the group as well. But as I said before, despite a lot of this new experimentation that the group does on this record, this still manages to be the most cohesive release so far. And I think in part that's due to there being a really cohesive idea behind this album, really exploring a lot of Brockhampton's fame since the group rose to popularity last year with the 3 Saturation albums that they've released. And now on this album, they're kind of reflecting on that and coming to terms with the fact that it's not quite as great as maybe they initially expected it to be. And don't get me wrong, they do explore some of the positives of their fame here on this thing. However, more often than not on this album, they come to terms with the fact that they're still really haven't, at least when it comes to their own happiness, improved all that much from where they were before the Saturation trilogy. Despite losing some of the problems they had prior to rising to fame, they've gained a lot of new problems as well. And really, it's pretty interesting to see the group reflect on this, especially as someone who's been following them since the start of the Saturation trilogy with the release of the first album in that series. And during that album, they were such a hungry group in terms of wanting to get that popularity, wanting to get that success, really. You could hear it in the music there. And here on this album, now that they finally have gotten that success to some extent, it's pretty interesting seeing them reflect on it overall. Really, it just makes for both a very interesting listen in that regard, but it's also a pretty relatable listen as well. And I know the whole more money, more problems dilemma isn't one that's particularly new, but it's one that's explored in a very interesting manner here on this project. So at the end of the day, I love the lyrics across this thing. I love the mix of sounds that you get here on this album as well. You have your noisier, more experimental cuts. You have your straight-up banging tracks. You have your slower, more introspective cuts on this thing as well. But all the performances across all of these different types of songs are always fantastic when it comes to the singing, when it comes to the rapping, when it comes to the production and the overall construction of these songs. It's always fantastic. I really love how real these guys have been throughout all their music, and I especially like how they're real enough to reevaluate where they are at this point in their career and assess both the positives and the negatives. And I'm pretty excited to see what these guys do going forward in the future coming off of this record. Not just because of how much I love this thing, but also to see where they are on that next project in general. So yeah, this album, just from start to finish, is a fantastic listen. There's no weak cuts on this thing at all. Every single song on this thing is interesting and unique and enjoyable in its own right, but also made even more enjoyable by listening to the album as a whole. And this album is just one that every time I return to it this year, I found myself falling in love with it all over again. So yeah, this is a fantastic release that you should definitely check out if you haven't done so already. It's rare for me to give an album a 10 out of 10. I don't do it all that often. So when I say I gave this album a perfect score, I'm just really trying to stress how much I love this thing and how much you should definitely give it a shot. Though with that said, that concludes this list here today, my top 20 favorite albums of 2018. Once again, this entire list is just based on my own personal opinion and the albums I happen to hear in 2018. Leave yours in the comment section below, as I said before. And while you're down there, also make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. I have that Rate Your Music list linked in the description down below containing all the albums I heard this year ranked, as I said before. And I also have a playlist linked down below of all my year-end countdown videos here on YouTube. Not just the year-end countdown videos for 2018, though. It also has the ones from 2017 and just any other lists I've done on the channel in general. So if you want to see all those, make sure you check out that playlist. Thank you guys for watching once again, and stay golden.